Here's something they don't tell you about samurai-era Japan. If you were born a peasant, a warrior could legally cut you down in the street for looking at him wrong. No trial, no investigation, no consequences. Your life ended because you forgot to bow deeply enough. But that's not even the darkest part. Picture this. You spend an entire year growing rice, planting each seedling by hand, bent over in freezing water until your spine curves permanently, weeding in the scorching sun until your hands bleed, harvesting until you can barely stand. And at the end of it all, after 12 months of backbreaking labor, you hand over 70% of everything you grew to a lord you've never met. The rest? Still not yours to eat. That rice is currency, and you're not wealthy enough to afford it. So you eat millet, barley, sometimes nothing at all. Your neighbors are required by law to report your every move. Your children are watching you starve, and there's nothing you can do about it. You can't leave your village without written permission. You can't change your occupation. You can't marry who you want. You can't even dress in clothes above your station. And if you protest, if you dare to complain about the impossible tax burden crushing your family, there are punishments so brutal, I'll need to ease you into them. This was life for 80% of Japan's population for over 250 years. Not the romanticized world of tea ceremonies and cherry blossoms, but something far darker. A surveillance state so sophisticated it would make modern governments jealous. An economic system designed to keep you perpetually on the edge of starvation. A hierarchy so rigid that your great-great-grandchildren were still bound by decisions made centuries before they were born. Tonight, we're stripping away the beautiful facade of feudal Japan to reveal what life was actually like for the people who grew the food, built the buildings, and died young so that samurai could philosophize about honor. By the time we're done, you'll understand why the title of this video isn't hyperbole. You genuinely wouldn't have survived a single month as a peasant in feudal Japan. And here's the twist you're not expecting. Some of the worst parts weren't the violence or the starvation. They were the quiet psychological horrors that made people complicit in their own oppression. Let's begin. The Iron Cage. Understanding Japan's rigid class system. The system had a name, shinōkōshō. 4 characters that determined everything about your life from the moment you were born until the moment you died. Samurai, farmers, artisans, merchants, in that order. This wasn't just a social ranking. It was law, enforced with brutal efficiency by the Tokugawa shogunate that ruled Japan for over 2.5 centuries. But here's what makes it different from European feudalism. This wasn't about how much money you had. Wealthy merchants, men who could buy and sell entire villages, sat at the bottom of the hierarchy. Poor samurai, who could barely afford to feed their families, still commanded absolute authority over everyone below them. The system was based on Confucian philosophy imported from China, which ranked people not by wealth, but by what philosophers called their moral purity. Those who produced food sustained society. Those who created goods supported daily life. Those who merely exchanged what others made were parasites. The farmers, the no in shinōkōshō, made up roughly 80% of Japan's population. You'd think that would give them some power, some collective voice. But the system was designed precisely to prevent that. Every aspect of peasant life was regulated, watched, controlled. The Tokugawa shogunate, paranoid about the social mobility that had characterized the previous century of civil war, wanted a frozen society. They'd seen how Toyotomi Hideyoshi, one of Japan's greatest leaders, had been born the son of a peasant. That kind of story couldn't happen again. In 1588, Hideyoshi himself had conducted the Great Sword Hunt, the Katana Gari, confiscating weapons from the peasantry and melting them down. The message was clear. Peasants were farmers, not warriors, and they would stay that way. By 1591, laws explicitly prohibited warriors from becoming farmers, and farmers from becoming warriors. You were born into your class, and you would die in it. Your children would inherit your status, and their children after them, generation after generation. The emperor sat above it all, a divine figure descended from the sun goddess, Amaterasu, but possessing no real power. That belonged to the shogun, the military dictator who ruled from Edo, modern-day Tokyo. Below the shogun were the daimyo, powerful feudal lords who controlled domains across Japan. Each daimyo ruled his territory with near absolute authority, maintaining his own laws, collecting his own taxes, commanding his own armies of samurai. But all of them answered to the shogun, who could strip a daimyo of his lands without warning if he showed even a hint of disloyalty. The samurai class, the shi, made up only about 10% of the population, but they were everywhere. In the cities, manning administrative posts and collecting taxes. In the countryside, supervising agricultural production and maintaining order. They were the enforcers of the system, the visible reminder that someone was always watching. And they carried with them a privilege that speaks volumes about the nature of feudal Japanese society. Kirisut Gomen, the right to kill. Here's how it worked. If a peasant failed to show proper respect, if they spoke out of turn, if they simply looked at a samurai the wrong way, that samurai could draw his sword and cut them down on the spot. No trial, no investigation, no consequences. As long as the samurai later reported the incident to their superior with a plausible justification. The peasant's life was forfeit, their family shamed, and the samurai would walk away without a stain on his honor. And here's the part that makes your blood run cold. This privilege extended to testing new swords. The practice was called tamishigiri. A samurai who purchased a new blade might want to know how well it cut. So they'd find a peasant, or sometimes use a condemned criminal, and simply cut them down to test the weapon's quality. This wasn't even classified as murder. It was quality control. Historical records document these tests, often noting how many bodies a blade could cut through in a single stroke. This wasn't just theoretical intimidation. It happened. Not constantly. Most samurai weren't psychopaths wandering around killing peasants for sport. But it happened often enough that every peasant child grew up knowing to bow deeply when a samurai passed, to keep their eyes on the ground, to make themselves small and invisible. The threat alone was enough to maintain order. Beneath even the peasants were the outcasts, the burakumin, people whose occupations brought them into contact with death and pollution. Butchers, tanners, executioners, undertakers. They lived in segregated communities, forbidden from entering temples or mixing with other classes. Their children couldn't marry outside their caste. They were, in the eyes of society, not fully human. And yet, for all the suffering of the burakumin, at least they understood their place. At least they knew where they stood. For peasants, the cruelty was more subtle. They were called honorable. The rhetoric of the system placed them second in importance, right below the samurai. After all, without farmers, no one ate. Without rice, the entire economy collapsed. So peasants were told they were valued, essential, the foundation of society. And then they were taxed until they could barely survive. They were praised in public and bled dry in private. It was a particular kind of psychological torture, being told you were important while being treated as expendable. And here's the thing that made it all work. Most people believed it, not because they were stupid or brainwashed, but because this was all they'd ever known. Your grandfather had been a peasant. Your father was a peasant. You were a peasant. Your children would be peasants. The idea of anything else wasn't just impossible. It was literally unthinkable. The system had existed for so long, was reinforced so thoroughly through law and custom and daily life, that it felt like a law of nature, as immutable as the seasons or the motion of the stars. This was the cage you were born into, and every single day of your life would be shaped by its iron bars. The endless cycle, daily life, and agricultural labor. The day began before dawn. No alarm clocks, no gradual awakening. You simply opened your eyes in the darkness because your body had learned, over years and years, exactly when to wake. In the summer months, that meant around 4 in the morning. In winter, maybe an hour later, though the work waited regardless of the season or your exhaustion. Your house was small. If you were a typical peasant family in the Edo period, you might have been allowed a dwelling roughly 12 feet by 27 feet. That was it. 1 or 2 rooms at most, with walls made of woven bamboo and packed mud, a thatched roof that needed constant maintenance, and an earthen floor in the entrance area where you could remove your sandals. The rest of the floor was raised, covered with rough woven mats if you were fortunate, bare wood if you weren't. In that space lived your entire family. You, your spouse, your children, perhaps your aging parents. 5 to 7 people sharing 250 square feet. Privacy didn't exist. Personal space was a luxury you couldn't afford. At night, you laid out thin sleeping mats and huddled together for warmth. In the morning, you rolled them up and went to work. There was no bathroom, no running water. You used a hole dug in the ground outside, collecting human waste to use as fertilizer in the fields. It was one of the few resources you had in abundance. In the corner of your home was a small hearth, raised off the floor to protect the tatami mats if you had them. This was where your family cooked, where you gathered on the coldest nights, where the smoke rose through the thatched roof, blackening the straw and keeping insects at bay. The smoke had nowhere else to go. You breathed it in constantly, your lungs slowly filling with soot over the decades. If you were lucky, you might have had a small kettle for boiling water, a few wooden bowls, maybe a cooking pot. That was the extent of your possessions. No furniture to speak of, no decorations, no books. Most peasants couldn't read anyway, and books were expensive luxuries reserved for the samurai class and wealthy merchants. Your home was purely functional, a shelter from the rain and cold, nothing more. But you didn't spend much time there. From the moment the sky began to lighten, you were in the fields. Rice farming in feudal Japan was brutally labor-intensive. This wasn't mechanized agriculture. This was you, bent at the waist, your feet sinking into mud and water, your hands moving constantly, planting and weeding and harvesting, day after day after day. The rice-growing cycle dominated the entire year. In early spring, you prepared the seed beds, carefully selecting the best seeds from last year's crop, soaking them, watching them germinate. While the seeds sprouted, you flooded the paddies, breaking up the soil with wooden plows pulled by oxen if your village was wealthy enough to own them, or by human muscle if it wasn't. The water had to be exactly right, deep enough to nurture the rice, shallow enough that you could still work. You managed this through an intricate system of irrigation channels and dikes, maintained by the entire village working together. Then came the transplanting. This was the worst part, the work that broke backs and twisted spines permanently out of alignment. You took each delicate rice seedling and pushed it into the waterlogged soil, one by one by one, bent over at the waist for 12, 14, sometimes 16 hours a day. Your back screamed, your hands cramped, your legs went numb from standing in cold water, and there were thousands of seedlings, hundreds of thousands. The entire village worked together because there was no other way to finish in time. After transplanting came the endless weeding. Rice paddies were perfect environments for all sorts of unwanted plants, and letting them grow meant losing your crop. So you bent down again, running your hands through the water and mud, feeling for the roots of weeds, pulling them up, moving to the next plant, and the next, and the next. The sun beat down on your back. Your body ached in ways you'd long since stopped thinking about. Pain was just the baseline now, the normal state of existence. In the fall came harvest, and this was somehow even more exhausting than planting. You cut each plant individually with a small sickle, gathering the stalks into bundles, hauling them out of the paddies to dry. Then came the threshing, beating the stalks against wooden frames to knock loose the grains. Then winnowing, tossing the grain into the air so the wind could blow away the chaff. Your hands bled. Your shoulders burned. You worked until you could barely stand, and then you worked some more, because the harvest wait for no one. If rain came before you finished, you could lose everything. But you didn't stop thinking about rain. You prayed for rain, and then you prayed for it to stop. You watched the sky constantly, reading the clouds, trying to predict the weather because your life depended on it. Too much rain and the paddies flooded, drowning the young plants. Too little and they withered. You needed rain at exactly the right times, in exactly the right amounts, and you had no control over it whatsoever. You were at the mercy of forces you couldn't predict or influence, and you knew it. The work never truly ended. Even in winter, when the rice paddies lay fallow, there were other tasks. Making straw ropes and baskets, repairing tools and buildings, processing any crops you'd been allowed to keep, millet, barley, perhaps some vegetables from your tiny kitchen garden. The women of the family did the spinning and weaving, creating the rough hemp cloth that everyone wore. Children, once they were old enough to walk steadily, were put to work tending chickens, collecting firewood, helping with whatever small tasks they could manage. And through it all, you were hungry. Not the pleasant anticipation before a good meal. Real hunger, the kind that gnaws at you constantly, that makes you weak and dizzy, that keeps you awake at night. Because all that rice you were growing, all those hundreds of thousands of grains you'd planted and weeded and harvested, you didn't get to keep it. The cruel irony. Food, hunger, and famine. Here's the twisted reality of peasant life in feudal Japan. You could spend your entire life growing rice and never taste it. Rice was currency, the foundation of the entire economy. A daimyo's wealth was measured in koku, units of rice. One koku was roughly enough rice to feed one person for a year, about 180 liters or 150 kilograms. The smallest daimyo controlled at least 10,000 koku. The most powerful commanded hundreds of thousands. And where did all that rice come from? Your fields, your labor, your bent back and bleeding hands. But it wasn't yours to eat. It belonged to your lord, to be taken as tax, distributed to samurai as payment, sold at market to fund castle construction, or military campaigns, or the elaborate processions required by Senkan Kotai, the alternate attendance system that forced daimyo to maintain expensive households in Edo. During the reign of the third Tokugawa shogun, Iemitsu, farmers were explicitly forbidden from eating any of the rice they grew. They had to hand over every grain to the daimyo, then wait for him to give some back as charity. This wasn't universal or permanent, but it happened. It was possible. That tells you everything you need to know about the relationship between peasants and their rulers. Even in more typical circumstances, tax rates were crushing. 40% of your harvest was considered standard. Some villages paid 60%, others paid 70%. And these weren't calculated based on what you actually grew. They were based on estimated productivity, determined through land surveys that assessed what your fields should be producing under ideal conditions. Had a bad year, too little rain, too many insects, unexpected flooding. Didn't matter. You still owed the same amount. The tax burden was fixed, the risk entirely yours. So what did you eat? Millet, barley, wheat if you were fortunate. These were the grains of the poor, the ones you were allowed to keep because they couldn't be used to pay samurai stipends or satisfy daimyo obligations. You boiled them into a watery gruel. Mixed with wild vegetables you could forage from the mountains, perhaps some daikon radish from your small garden plot. Once or twice a year, if you were very lucky, you might taste fish. Meat was almost unheard of. Buddhism discouraged killing animals, and peasants certainly couldn't afford it anyway. Your diet was desperately lacking in protein, in fat, in essential nutrients. Children grew up stunted, their bodies never reaching their full potential because they never had enough to eat at crucial developmental stages. Women who somehow got pregnant often miscarried from malnutrition. Those who carried to term frequently died in childbirth, their bodies too weakened to survive the ordeal. Those who survived bore small, weak babies who might not live through their first winter. And then there were the famines. They came with terrible regularity, sweeping through Japan like waves of death. The Tenmei famine of 1782 to 1788 killed an estimated 900,000 people, a staggering figure in a country whose total population was around 30 million. The Tempo famine in the 1830s killed hundreds of thousands more. These weren't abstract disasters. They were slow, agonizing catastrophes that played out village by village, family by family, person by person. When famine struck, you watched your children grow thinner, their eyes becoming too large for their faces, their bellies swelling from malnutrition, a sign of protein deficiency, not fullness. You made impossible choices. Which child got the last handful of barley? Who would you try to save? Historical records from northeastern domains reveal something that long remained hidden in official histories. The practice known euphemistically as mabiki, meaning thinning out, like removing weak seedlings from a rice paddy. Documents from village headmen and traveling officials describe families who, facing certain starvation of all members, made a choice that's almost unbearable to contemplate. Contemporary records and later interviews with elderly villagers in the 19th century suggest that infanticide, particularly of newborns in the first days of life, occurred with grim regularity during the worst famines. This was never officially sanctioned. Buddhist priests denounced it from their pulpits. Domain officials occasionally prosecuted cases when they became too public, but the practice appears in enough different sources. Temple records noting suspiciously low birth rates during famine years, village documents, later oral histories, that historians now recognize it as a tragic reality of peasant life during times of extreme scarcity. The psychological burden this placed on families, particularly on mothers and midwives who often bore this impossible responsibility, is something we can only begin to imagine based on the sparse personal testimonies that survived. Some villages, desperate and starving, turned to their mountains and forests, stripping them of anything remotely edible. Tree bark, grass, roots, insects, dirt mixed with what little grain they had left, just to fill their stomachs with something, anything. Contemporary records from traveling officials describe people dying by the roadside, their bodies left where they fell, because no one had the strength to bury them properly. In certain regions, the horror went even further. Historical documents from the Tenmei and Tempo famines record a practice that reveals the depths of desperation. Traders from cities would arrive in starving villages with cash and rice. They weren't coming to help, they were coming to buy. Official complaints filed with domain authorities and later investigative reports describe how these opportunists offered starving families advances on their daughters' future earnings, taking girls as young as 7 or 8 to be sold into service or prostitution in urban areas. For parents facing the certain death of everyone, it must have seemed like an impossible, but perhaps necessary choice. The slim chance that at least some of their children might live, even if that life was one of exploitation. Domain records show that some daimyo attempted to prevent this practice, issuing prohibitions and occasionally punishing traders. But enforcement was sporadic, and during the worst famine years, desperate families and opportunistic traders found each other despite official restrictions. The psychological toll of chronic hunger is difficult for modern people to comprehend. Imagine never, not once in your entire life, feeling truly satisfied after a meal. Imagine your children crying from hunger pains, and you have nothing to give them. Imagine watching your elderly parents grow weaker and weaker, knowing they're deliberately eating less to leave more food for the younger generation, slowly starving themselves to death. And all of this was happening in the shadow of storehouses filled with rice, the daimyo's granaries, the samurai's stipend reserves, the merchant warehouses in cities, all holding thousands upon thousands of koku of rice while peasants died of starvation in the surrounding countryside. The rice was there. It existed. It just didn't belong to you. Some daimyo, to their credit, opened their storehouses during the worst famines, distributing rice to their starving subjects. But many didn't. And even those who did often provided too little, too late. The system wasn't designed to protect peasants. It was designed to extract as much as possible from them while keeping them barely alive enough to work next year's fields. There's a saying from the period that captures the philosophy perfectly. Sesame seeds and peasants produce the most when squeezed. Think about that. Peasants were explicitly compared to objects to be wrung dry, their value measured only in what could be taken from them. This wasn't secret policy whispered behind closed doors. This was the operating principle of the entire system, expressed openly because everyone understood it was how things worked. You learned to live with constant hunger. Your stomach stopped growling eventually. There wasn't enough energy for that. You learned to ignore the weakness, the dizziness, the way your vision sometimes went dark at the edges when you stood up too quickly. You learned to keep working even when your body screamed at you to stop, to rest, to please just let it have a moment's peace. Because if you stopped working, if you failed to meet your obligations, if you couldn't produce next year's crop, then it wasn't just you who suffered. The village collective taxation system meant that if you failed, your neighbors had to make up the difference. Your family's weakness became everyone's burden. So you kept going, bent over those rice paddies, planting and weeding and harvesting, growing food you'd never eat, year after year after year. The weight of obligation, taxation, and economic burden. Let's talk about numbers, real numbers, the kind that determined whether your family ate or starved, lived or died. The tax system in feudal Japan was called nengu, the annual tribute, and it was the mechanism through which the entire feudal structure extracted value from the peasant class. But here's what's truly shocking about this system. Two villages could be just 5 miles apart, and one might pay 30% of their harvest in taxes, while the other paid 70%. Recent analysis of domain records from 1868, just before the Meiji Restoration, revealed that tax rates varied wildly across Japan's 250-plus domains. The average was around 40%, but that average conceals a nightmare of variation. Some daimyo were relatively benevolent. Others squeezed their peasants until there was nothing left. And get this, there was a saying among domain administrators that perfectly captures the philosophy. Sesame seeds and peasants produce the most when squeezed. This wasn't whispered in private. It appeared in official correspondence, in administrative handbooks, in the advice given to new domain officials. The system openly acknowledged that it was designed to extract maximum value from human beings, and it compared those human beings to objects to be wrung dry. The base unit was the koku, that measure of rice productivity we mentioned earlier, roughly 180 liters, theoretically enough rice to feed one person for a year. When the Tokugawa shogunate conducted land surveys, they assessed each field's kokudaka, its theoretical annual yield under ideal conditions. Here's the cruel trick. Once that assessment was made, it became fixed. Your village might be assessed at 500 koku total productivity. If floods destroyed half your crop, you still owed taxes on 500 koku. If drought killed your rice, still 500 koku. The daimyo's revenue was guaranteed. All the risk fell on you. Let's walk through an example to make this concrete. Imagine your village was assessed at 1,000 koku total productivity. Your field was assessed at 10 koku, enough to feed 10 people for a year under ideal conditions. The daimyo's tax rate was 40%. So right off the top, you owed 4 koku of rice before you could keep anything for yourself. But that wasn't all. There were additional taxes layered on top of the base rate. A percentage for maintaining irrigation works, another for road maintenance, a contribution for the village headman's salary, a special levy if the daimyo was conducting major construction projects, building a castle, repairing damage from earthquake or fire, constructing new administrative buildings. These additional taxes could easily add another 10 or 15% to your burden. Then there was corvée labor, the requirement to provide free work on public projects. During certain times of the year, you were required to stop working your own fields and instead work on whatever the daimyo demanded: building roads, repairing dikes and irrigation channels, transporting goods, serving as porters when the daimyo traveled for Sankin Kotai. This wasn't just a day or two. It could be weeks, even months. Pulled away from your own farm during crucial planting or harvesting times. The corvée system was particularly insidious during Sankin Kotai. This was the Tokugawa shogunate's brilliant method of controlling the daimyo, requiring them to maintain residences in both their home domain and in Edo, alternating every other year, bringing with them enormous retinues of hundreds or thousands of samurai and servants. The massive processions required countless peasants to serve as porters, carrying supplies and equipment along the great roads connecting provinces to the capital. Your daimyo needed you to drop everything and spend 3 weeks hauling rice and luggage over mountain passes? That's what you did. Your fields needed attention at exactly that moment? Too bad. Someone else in your family would have to manage, or the work simply wouldn't get done. And you received no compensation for this labor. It was your obligation, your duty as a subject of your lord. The village taxation system operated through collective responsibility. The village headman, the shoya or nanushi, depending on the region, was responsible for ensuring the entire village met its tax obligations. This man was usually from the wealthiest peasant family, someone with education, someone who could read and write and negotiate with samurai officials. He allocated the tax burden among individual families, keeping detailed records, managing the collection and storage of rice, and delivering it to the daimyo's warehouses. But here's where it gets interesting. If one family couldn't pay their share, the rest of the village had to make up the difference. This created enormous social pressure for conformity and production. Your neighbor's failure became your problem. Their bad luck became your burden. So villages policed themselves, everyone watching everyone else, making sure no one shirked their duties or hid part of their harvest. This was reinforced by the gonengumi system, the 5 family groups. Every 5 households were organized into a mutual responsibility unit. If someone in your gonengumi committed a crime, all 5 families could be punished. If one family failed to pay their taxes, the other 4 had to cover it. This created a surveillance network more effective than any police force could have been. You didn't need government officials watching your every move. Your neighbors did it for you, because their survival depended on your compliance. The debt trap was nearly impossible to escape. In a bad year, when the harvest fell short and you couldn't meet your tax obligations, you had 3 choices. First, you could borrow rice from the village granary if one existed, promising to repay it with interest the next year. But next year was rarely better, so you'd borrow again, and the debt would grow. Second, you could borrow from wealthy neighbors or village headmen who often functioned as informal moneylenders. The interest rates were extortionate, 20%, 30%, sometimes higher, and the collateral was usually your land. If you defaulted, which you almost inevitably did, you lost your field and became a tenant farmer, working land you used to own, handing over even more of your harvest to your new landlord while still owing taxes to the daimyo. Third, you could sell yourself or your family members into temporary servitude. Some peasants sold themselves to wealthy families for a period of years, working as servants or laborers, their wages sent back to their families. Others sold their daughters. The practice was common enough that there were established rates, standard contracts, whole systems built around it. And once you entered that spiral, it was almost impossible to climb back out. The castle-town daimyo, particularly in the later Edo period, often lived beyond their means. They were expected to maintain elaborate lifestyles, to display wealth and power appropriate to their rank. This meant expensive ceremonies, fine clothing, large retinues, generous gifts to other daimyo and to the shogun. All of this cost money, and the money came from peasants. Some daimyo were more progressive, lowering tax rates, investing in agricultural improvements, treating their subjects with something approaching compassion. The Saga domain in Kyushu, for example, managed its finances relatively well and maintained lower tax rates than neighboring domains. But these were exceptions. Most daimyo squeezed their peasants as hard as they could, driven by the constant financial pressure of maintaining their position in the rigid hierarchy of Tokugawa Japan. And remember, you weren't just paying rice taxes. Everything was taxed. The vegetables from your garden, the chickens you raised, the hemp you wove into cloth, the charcoal you burned for cooking, the salt you used to preserve food. Every aspect of economic life had someone's hand reaching in, taking a piece. The cumulative burden, when you added everything together, could easily exceed 60 or 70% of everything you produced. The system was designed to keep you right at the edge of subsistence. Not quite starving, because then you couldn't work, but never comfortable, never secure, never able to build up enough surplus to become independent. You were trapped in a cycle of endless labor and perpetual poverty, generation after generation, with no way out and no hope of improvement. And if you complained, if you protested the unfairness, the cruelty, the impossible burden, well, that's when you learned about the other face of feudal Japan, the face of punishment and control. The price of disobedience, laws, justice, and punishment. There was no presumption of innocence in feudal Japan. No lawyers to defend you. No jury of your peers. If samurai authorities decided you were guilty, you were guilty. The legal system existed not to discover truth or ensure justice, but to maintain order and demonstrate the power of the ruling class over everyone below them. The criminal justice system operated on two parallel tracks. For samurai, there were elaborate codes of conduct, complex procedures, and the ever-present option of seppuku, ritual suicide that allowed a samurai to die with honor rather than face public humiliation. For commoners, there was simply punishment, swift and brutal, designed to serve as a deterrent to others. Let's start with the punishments themselves, because understanding the violence of the system is essential to understanding how it maintained control. The most common punishment for minor offenses was flogging. You'd be tied to a post and beaten with bamboo canes across your back and buttocks, the number of strikes depending on the severity of your crime. 20 strikes for a first offense of theft, 50 for a second offense, 100 or more for serious crimes like assault or arson. But flogging was merciful compared to what awaited more serious offenders. Crucifixion existed, though it was called something different, haritsuke. The condemned was tied to a cross, their arms spread wide, and left to die slowly of exposure and exhaustion. Sometimes spears would be thrust into their sides to speed the process. The body would be left on display for days or weeks, a rotting warning to anyone who passed by. For the most severe crimes, particularly those against authority, there was burning at the stake, sawing people in half, boiling in oil, and a method called kamiyude, being cooked alive in a giant iron pot. These weren't medieval myths or exaggerations. They happened. Executioners maintained their skills across generations, and there were established protocols for each method. And then there was the collective punishment. If you committed a serious crime, murder, treason, attacking a samurai, your entire family could be executed alongside you. Your wife, your children, your parents, your siblings. The principle was clear. Crime was a stain on the entire family line, and the only way to remove that stain was to eliminate everyone who carried it. Let me give you a specific example that shows just how far this went. In the case of the 1686 Jokyo uprising in the Matsumoto domain, which we'll discuss more later, after the rebellion was suppressed, domain authorities didn't just execute the leaders. They arrested Tada Kasuke, the main organizer, along with his fellow leaders. Then they went further. They executed Kasuke's 12-year-old son, his 10-year-old son, another leader's 5-year-old child who hadn't even participated in the uprising and probably didn't understand what was happening. In total, 28 farmers were executed, including children who had committed no crime except being born to the wrong fathers. And here's the part that makes it even more chilling. One of the executed was a 16-year-old girl named Oshiun. Her crime? She had delivered invitations to secret meetings for her father. Because women weren't typically executed for such offenses under Edo law, officials falsified the execution records, changing her name to a masculine form so they could legally kill her. They found a way around their own laws to make sure a teenage girl died for trying to help her family. The crime of treason, defined broadly as any action undermining the shogun or a daimyo, carried the harshest punishment of all. You'd be paraded through the streets before execution, your shame on public display. People would gather to watch, families bringing their children to witness what happened to those who defied authority. Then you'd be beheaded, and your severed head would be displayed on a stake at a public execution ground, your features slowly decomposing in the sun until there was nothing left but bone. For peasants specifically, there were additional considerations. If you were arrested for a crime, you'd be held in a local jail, often just a small wooden cage, barely large enough to crouch in, exposed to weather and insects, fed minimal rations, perhaps tortured to extract a confession. Torture was standard practice. It wasn't hidden or controversial, just a routine part of the judicial process. The magistrate who judged your case was also your prosecutor and, effectively, your executioner. There was no separation of powers, no checks on their authority. If they decided you were guilty, that was the end of it. You could confess, which might result in a slightly less painful death. Or you could maintain your innocence, which would lead to more torture until you confessed anyway. Confessions were required for execution, so the system always found a way to obtain them. But here's the most insidious part. Samurai had kirisuit gomen, that right we mentioned earlier. If a samurai felt you had insulted them, shown insufficient respect, or simply irritated them, they could kill you on the spot. They were supposed to report the killing to their superior afterward, providing justification. In practice, this meant they could murder peasants with impunity. Your life was worth less than a samurai's momentary anger. There are records of samurai testing new swords on peasant bodies. The practice was called tameshigiri. A samurai might purchase a new blade and want to know how well it cut. So they'd find a peasant, or sometimes a condemned criminal, and simply cut them down to test the weapon. This wasn't even classified as murder. It was quality testing. The laws themselves were vast and intricate, codified in documents like the Kujikata Osadamagaki, the Tokugawa Code of Criminal Procedure compiled in 1742. This 103-volume work laid out in exhaustive detail what constituted crimes, what punishments applied, how trials should be conducted. But for peasants, the specifics didn't matter much. You weren't expected to know the law. You were just expected to obey. Some laws specifically targeted peasant behavior. You weren't allowed to wear silk. You weren't allowed to live in houses above a certain size. You weren't allowed to use umbrellas unless you were wealthy peasants. You weren't allowed to ride horses. You weren't allowed to eat rice regularly. You weren't allowed to leave your village without permission. These weren't suggestions. They were law, enforced with fines, beatings, or worse. The permission system for travel was particularly restrictive. If you wanted to visit another village, even one just a few miles away, you needed written permission from your village headman, who needed permission from samurai authorities. Pilgrimages to religious sites were one of the few exceptions, but even those required documentation and could be revoked at any time. Checkpoints, called shikisho, controlled all major roads. The most famous was the Hakone checkpoint between Edo and the provinces. All travelers had to present documentation proving their identity and their reason for travel. Women were scrutinized especially carefully because the Sankin-kotai system required daimyo to leave their wives and children in Edo as hostages. Any woman trying to leave the capital without authorization was assumed to be fleeing daimyo, and that meant rebellion. The penalties for unauthorized travel were severe. You could be arrested, imprisoned, flogged, even executed, depending on circumstances. Your village headman could be punished for allowing you to leave. Your family could face collective punishment. So people stayed put. They lived their entire lives within a radius of maybe 10 or 15 miles, never seeing the ocean if they lived inland, never seeing mountains if they lived on the coast. The world beyond their village was essentially fictional, known only through rumors and the occasional traveling merchant's tales. This system of control extended into every aspect of life. Village regulations governed when you could marry, what you could name your children, how you could decorate your home, what festivals you could celebrate. The gonengumi, those 5 family, mutual responsibility groups, met regularly to ensure everyone was following the rules, to report any suspicious behavior, to maintain the network of surveillance that made formal policing almost unnecessary. And if you thought about resisting, about organizing any kind of opposition, you knew what awaited you. The 1637 Shimabara Rebellion, a massive uprising of Catholic peasants in western Japan, was crushed with overwhelming force. The rebels held out for months in Hara Castle, but when the castle finally fell, the shogunate's forces massacred everyone inside. 37,000 people died. Men, women, children, anyone associated with the rebellion. The message was clear and final. Resistance was futile. After Shimabara, serious armed rebellion became almost unthinkable. There were still uprisings, still protests, still moments of resistance, but they were carefully calibrated, designed to pressure authorities while avoiding outright rebellion that would bring down overwhelming violence. Peasants learned to work within the system, using its own rules and procedures against itself, petitioning and pleading, and occasionally engaging in symbolic protests. But always, always, at the back of your mind was the knowledge of what could happen if you pushed too far. The sight of a head rotting on a spike. The memory of a neighbor dragged away in the night, their screams echoing through the village. The stories of torture and execution passed down through generations. Fear was the final tool of control, and it worked. The web of surveillance, social control, and daily monitoring. Imagine living in a panopticon, that prison design where guards can watch every cell from a central tower, where prisoners never know if they're being observed, but must assume they always are. That was feudal Japan for the peasant class, except the guards were your neighbors, your family, everyone you knew. And the punishment for stepping out of line was swift and absolute. But here's the twist that makes this system truly brilliant in its cruelty. The Tokugawa shogunate didn't need to pay for a massive police force. They didn't need informants on every corner or secret police watching your every move. They created a system where you policed yourself, where your neighbors had no choice but to police you, where everyone was simultaneously guard and prisoner. The gonengumi system deserves deeper examination because it was the linchpin of social control. 5 families, bound together by law, each responsible for the other's behavior. If one family harbored a criminal, all 5 faced punishment. If one family failed to report suspicious activity, all 5 faced punishment. If one family tried to flee their obligations, all 5 faced punishment. These weren't informal neighborhood watch groups. They were legally mandated organizations with specific duties outlined in the Kujikata Osadamagaki, the 1742 Criminal Code. Once a month, or more frequently in some domains, the 5 families were required to gather. They'd review the rules, recite the regulations, confirm that everyone was following the law. They'd discuss any problems, any concerns, any changes in circumstances. And crucially, they'd sign their names, or mark their seals if they couldn't write, to documents affirming their collective compliance. The documents were remarkably detailed. Affirmations that no one was practicing Christianity, which remained banned throughout the Edo period after the Shimabara Rebellion. Confirmations that all marriages had been properly registered at local temples. Statements that no one had harbored criminals or hidden taxable goods. Declarations that everyone had attended mandatory temple registrations. And most importantly, pledges that if anyone noticed violations, they would report them immediately, because failing to report meant you were complicit in the crime. This system created a culture of mutual surveillance that went far beyond simple law enforcement. Your neighbors knew everything about you. They knew when you woke up and when you slept. They knew what you ate, who visited your home, where you went, what you talked about. Privacy was impossible. Every aspect of your life was potentially subject to scrutiny and judgment. The village headman, the shoya, sat at the center of this web. He was the intermediary between the village and the samurai administration, the man who collected taxes, distributed corvée labor assignments, maintained records of births and deaths and marriages, and reported any problems to higher authorities. He was usually from the wealthiest peasant family, educated enough to read and write, politically savvy enough to navigate the demands of both the daimyo and his fellow villagers. In theory, the headman represented the village's interests. In practice, he was often the enforcer of samurai authority, the man who made sure everyone stayed in line. His position came with privileges, exemption from certain taxes, a larger house, more prestige. But it also came with responsibility. If his village failed to meet its obligations, he'd be held personally accountable. So he had every incentive to squeeze production from his neighbors, to report violations, to maintain the system that benefited him. Temple registration, the Taraki system, added another layer of surveillance. Everyone was required to register with a Buddhist temple in their area. The temple maintained records proving you weren't Christian, and these records were checked regularly by officials. You had to participate in temple ceremonies, make donations you could barely afford, and accept the priest's authority over various aspects of your life. The temple became another set of eyes watching you, another institution ensuring compliance. The barriers to internal migration were extraordinary. Remember, you couldn't just leave your village and move somewhere else. You needed permission from your headman, approval from samurai authorities, acceptance by the village you wanted to join. And why would another village accept you? You'd be another mouth to feed, another tax obligation, another potential problem. Most villages actively resisted outsiders unless they had specific skills that were needed. Even marriage required approval. If you wanted to marry someone from another village, that person needed permission to join your village, or you needed permission to join theirs. The paperwork could take months. Officials checked to ensure the marriage wouldn't create any problems, wouldn't reduce tax revenue, wouldn't undermine the stable population distribution they'd worked so hard to maintain. This meant that most people married within their village, generation after generation. The gene pool was small. Genetic disorders accumulated. But that was preferable to the chaos of free movement, at least from the perspective of the authorities. A stable, immobile population was an easily controlled population. The system also extended to occupational control. Your occupation was determined by your birth. If your father was a farmer, you were a farmer. If your father was a carpenter, you were a carpenter. You weren't allowed to change occupations without permission, and that permission was rarely granted. The reasoning was the same: stability above all else. If peasants could freely change occupations, if they could become merchants or artisans or even samurai, the whole rigid hierarchy would collapse. In practice, there was some flexibility, especially in towns where the distinction between peasants, artisans, and merchants blurred. But in rural villages, where most people lived, your occupation was fixed. You farmed because your father farmed because your grandfather farmed, and your children would farm after you. The cycle was unbreakable. The authorities also controlled information through strict censorship. Books and pamphlets were screened before publication. Traveling performers and storytellers were monitored. News from outside your domain was filtered through official channels. You had no independent way to learn about what was happening in other parts of Japan, much less the wider world. You knew only what the authorities wanted you to know. This information control was crucial during times of unrest. If peasants in another domain were rebelling, authorities could prevent that news from spreading. If new ideas about social equality or political reform were circulating in cities, they could stop those ideas from reaching rural villages. The peasantry remained isolated, ignorant of alternatives, unable to even imagine that things could be different. The clothing regulations we mentioned earlier served a surveillance function too. Sumptuary laws didn't just restrict what you could wear based on your class. They made your class immediately visible to everyone who saw you. A samurai could identify a peasant at a glance by their rough hemp clothing, their plain colors, their simple design. There was no blending in, no pretending to be something you weren't. Your clothing was a uniform that announced your place in society to everyone around you. Even your house was regulated. The size, the design, the materials, all were prescribed by law based on your class and status. Officials could inspect homes to ensure compliance. If you built something too elaborate, if you used materials reserved for higher classes, you'd be punished and forced to tear it down. Your very shelter had to reflect and reinforce your social position. And perhaps most insidiously, the system encouraged people to internalize these restrictions. After generations of surveillance and punishment, people began to police themselves. Didn't try to wear silk because it didn't occur to you. You didn't think about leaving your village because you couldn't imagine living anywhere else. You didn't question the system because you'd been taught from birth that this was simply how the world worked, as natural and inevitable as the changing seasons. The psychological weight of this surveillance was crushing. You could never relax, never let your guard down, never express frustration or anger or doubt without risking someone reporting you. You learned to smile and nod and agree, to keep your thoughts to yourself, to maintain a facade of contentment no matter what you felt inside. You learned that survival meant conformity, that safety meant silence. And the terrible thing was, it worked. For 2.5 centuries, the Tokugawa shogunate maintained this system of surveillance and control with remarkable success. There were occasional uprisings, moments of resistance, but nothing that seriously threatened the overall structure. The system was so comprehensive, so thoroughly embedded in every aspect of daily life, that it seemed unbreakable, until, eventually, it broke. But that's getting ahead of our story. Bodies broken, disease, medicine, and life expectancy. Let's talk about death. Not the dramatic, violent death of execution or famine, but the quiet, commonplace death that was simply part of life in feudal Japan. The death that came from disease, from infections, from childbirth, from injuries that would be trivial today but were fatal then. The death that stalked every peasant family, claiming children and adults alike with casual regularity. Here's a number that should shock you. A skeletal study of medieval remains from the Uegahama Minami site in Kamakura found a life expectancy at birth of just 24 years. 24. If you somehow made it to 15, surviving all the childhood diseases that killed so many, you could expect maybe another 16 years if you were male, 18 if you were female. Let that sink in. Most people died before age 40. Now, these were urban poor from an earlier period, and conditions did improve somewhat during the Edo period. Life expectancy rose to somewhere between 30 and 50 years, depending on your location and circumstances. But compare that to samurai and wealthy merchants who regularly lived into their 60s or 70s. The disparity wasn't just about poverty. It was about a system that literally consumed peasant bodies, wearing them out through labor and malnutrition while preserving the health of those whose position depended on that consumption. Childhood mortality was staggering. Roughly 1 in every 3 children died before reaching age 5. Let me put that in perspective. If you had 3 children, you could statistically expect one of them to die before their 5th birthday. This wasn't rare tragedy. This was normal. Parents went into childbirth and child-rearing expecting loss, preparing for grief, because the odds were simply against you. The diseases that killed you were both familiar and unstoppable. Smallpox swept through villages periodically, killing or disfiguring survivors with characteristic pockmarks. Tuberculosis consumed people slowly, their lungs deteriorating over months or years until they couldn't breathe. Parasitic infections from poor sanitation caused chronic diarrhea and malnutrition. Leprosy, though less common, was particularly feared because sufferers were exiled from communities, forced to live as outcasts. Childbirth was especially dangerous. Without modern medical knowledge, without sterile conditions, without proper nutrition during pregnancy, women died in astonishing numbers. Hemorrhaging, infection, obstructed labor, all were potential death sentences. And remember, peasant women were often malnourished, their bodies weakened by years of inadequate food and hard labor. They entered childbirth already compromised, and many didn't survive. Those who did survive childbirth often faced the agony of losing their newborns. Infants died from diseases we can easily treat today. A simple fever could kill. Diarrhea could kill. A respiratory infection could kill. Mothers would watch their babies sicken and die, helpless to do anything but hold them as life slipped away. The medical knowledge of the period was a mixture of Chinese traditional medicine, indigenous Japanese practices, and gradually infiltrating European ideas from Dutch traders. Physicians existed, but they served primarily the samurai and merchant classes. Peasants couldn't afford doctors. When you got sick, you relied on folk remedies passed down through generations, most of which were useless, some of which actually made things worse. You might visit the village priest, who might perform religious rituals to drive out evil spirits believed to cause disease. You might try herbal remedies. There were effective ones, accumulated through centuries of trial and error. Willow bark for pain relief, artemisia for fevers, ginger for digestive issues. But many folk remedies were based on sympathetic magic or superstition, and they did nothing. Acupuncture existed, introduced from China, and could provide real relief for certain conditions. But again, this was primarily available to those who could afford practitioners. Moxibustion, burning moxa herb on specific points on the body, was more accessible and became popular during the Edo period. Whether it actually helped or just provided a placebo effect is debatable. What about injuries? Imagine you're working in the fields and you cut yourself badly on a farm implement. The wound would be washed, if you were fortunate, and bandaged with cloth. But infection was almost inevitable. Without antibiotics, without proper antiseptics, a simple cut could become infected. The infection could spread, and you could die of sepsis. Broken bones were set as best as possible, but without x-rays or proper massages. Casting materials, They often healed poorly or not at all. A broken leg could leave you permanently disabled, unable to work effectively, a burden on your family. A broken spine from a fall or accident might paralyze you, condemning you to a bed until you died of complications. Dental health was abysmal. No dentists for peasants. No toothbrushes. People cleaned their teeth by rubbing them with cloth or chewing on twigs, but cavities and gum disease were rampant. Abscessed teeth caused excruciating pain with no relief except extraction, typically done by someone with no medical training, no anesthesia, just brute force and the hope that you didn't die of infection afterward. Chronic pain was universal. Your back permanently damaged from decades of stooping and rice paddies. Your joints arthritic from constant labor in cold, wet conditions. Your hands deformed by endless repetitive tasks. Your feet calloused and broken from walking barefoot or in simple straw sandals over rough ground. Pain was just your constant companion, from your 20s until you died. And the malnutrition we discussed earlier, it made everything worse. Your immune system was compromised, so you got sick more often and more severely. Your bones were weak, so fractures were more common. Your wounds healed slowly. Your body simply didn't have the resources to maintain itself properly, so it slowly broke down, piece by piece. Women faced additional health challenges. Anemia from poor diet and repeated pregnancies was common. Prolapsed uterus from multiple childbirths and heavy labor was common. Fistulas from obstructed labor, leaving women incontinent, were common. These conditions made daily life even more difficult and humiliating, but there was no treatment available. Mental health? The concept barely existed. Depression, anxiety, what we'd now recognize as PTSD from trauma, these were just part of life. You dealt with them by working harder, by praying to Buddha or the kami, by drinking sake when you could afford it. People who became severely mentally ill might be cared for by their families if resources allowed, or they might be abandoned, left to wander as outcasts. The elderly, when they reached old age, were respected, but also burdens. In wealthy families, in good times, they'd be cared for. But in poor families, during lean times, there was a practice called uba sutayama, abandoning elderly relatives in mountains to die. Whether this was as common as later folklore suggested is debated by historians. But even the existence of the practice, even as an extreme response to desperation, tells you something about the brutal calculus of survival. Compare all of this to the samurai class. They had access to doctors trained in Chinese medicine, and increasingly, Western medical knowledge filtered through Dutch traders at Nagasaki. They had nutritious diets that kept them healthy. They didn't do back-breaking physical labor that destroyed their bodies. The disparity in health outcomes between classes was stark. Samurai lived longer, healthier lives, while peasants wore out their bodies and died young. There's a famous Japanese saying, "A peasant's life is like morning dew. Here at dawn, gone by noon." That was the reality. Your life was short. Your health was poor. Your suffering was immense. And there was no help coming. You endured because you had no choice. You got sick, and you kept working because if you didn't, your family starved. You hurt, and you kept working because pain was normal, expected, unremarkable. You watched people die. Your children, your siblings, your parents, your neighbors, and you kept going because what else could you do? This was the physical reality of peasant life, the actual lived experience of having a body in feudal Japan. Not the aestheticized versions in art and literature, not the sanitized presentations in museums, but the daily grind of illness and pain and premature death. Your body was a tool that the system used until it broke, and then it simply got a new tool. Your children taking your place in the fields, the cycle continuing endlessly. Half a life, women in peasant society. If being a peasant was hard, being a woman peasant was harder still. You faced all the same grinding poverty, all the same labor, all the same surveillance and control, and then additional layers of oppression, specifically targeting your gender. But here's what might surprise you. Peasant women were not delicate flowers, protected from the harsh realities of agricultural life. That image of fragile Japanese femininity you might have in your mind. That was geisha. That was wealthy samurai women with their white painted faces and elaborate kimonos. That wasn't peasant women. Peasant women worked alongside men in the fields, performed the same backbreaking labor, endured the same hunger and exhaustion. From childhood, peasant girls learned to work. Not gentle, ladylike activities, but real labor. Planting rice seedlings, bent over in waterlogged paddies for hours. Weeding, harvesting, threshing, hauling water, collecting firewood, tending animals. The stooping, bending, lifting, carrying. The same tasks that destroyed men's bodies destroyed women's bodies too. And women were expected to do all of this while also managing household tasks. Cooking, cleaning, childcare, textile production. Actually, here's a fact that reveals something crucial. Textile production was primarily women's work across all classes, and it was economically vital to the entire nation. Peasant women spun hemp and wove it into rough cloth for their families' clothing and to sell or trade. This was skilled, tedious work done in whatever spare moments existed between field labor and household chores. Late at night by dim lamp or firelight, fingers moving automatically through practiced motions, women produced the fabric that clothed Japan's population. But because it was women's work, it was undervalued, taken for granted, assumed. Marriage for peasant women was somewhat less restrictive than for higher classes, though still tightly controlled. Among samurai families, marriages were purely political arrangements made without any input from the bride. Among peasants, there was slightly more room for compatibility and personal preference, though families still made the final decision based on economic considerations. You might have some say in which young man from the village you married, but you were getting married regardless, usually by your late teens or early 20s. The marriage itself was recorded at the local temple as part of the tarox system, but there was no elaborate ceremony, no expensive celebration, just a simple acknowledgement that two households were joining. You'd move into your husband's family home in most cases, becoming part of his family unit, subject to his parents' authority as well as his. Divorce was theoretically possible, and here's something that might surprise you. Divorce rates in peasant communities were actually higher than historians once assumed. Recent analysis of temple records and village documents has revealed that if a marriage wasn't working, if a wife was unable to bear children, if personalities clashed unbearably, separation could and did happen more frequently than the rigid hierarchy would suggest. The process could be relatively straightforward. The husband would write a brief letter, the mikudarihan, or 3.5-line divorce, and the marriage was over. But here's the twist. Some scholars examining village records have found evidence that women could initiate this process too, though usually through their families or through temple intervention rather than directly. It was certainly harder than for men, but the system wasn't quite as inflexible as we might imagine. However, and this is the crucial limitation, a divorced woman could not remarry. Men could marry as many times as they wanted, or their economic circumstances allowed. Women got one chance. After that, you returned to your birth family if they'd take you, which many wouldn't because you'd bring shame and an extra mouth to feed. Or you tried to survive on your own, which was nearly impossible. Or you entered religious life as a Buddhist nun, which came with its own hardships and effectively ended your social existence. Widowhood was similar. If your husband died, you were expected to remain faithful to his memory for the rest of your life. You could manage his land if your sons were too young, but you couldn't remarry. Many widows entered Buddhist nunneries, not necessarily from religious devotion, but because it was one of the few socially acceptable options. Others stayed with their husband's family, caring for his parents and children, slowly fading into the background. Childbearing was, of course, expected and required. A woman who couldn't produce children, particularly sons to continue the family line and provide labor, was considered worthless. Multiple miscarriages or stillbirths were seen as a woman's failure, not the natural result of malnutrition and poor health. And remember, childbirth itself was dangerous. Each pregnancy was a roll of the dice that might kill you. If you survived pregnancy and childbirth, you were expected to nurse your child while continuing to work. There was no maternity leave, no period of rest and recovery. A few days to regain your strength, maybe a week, and then back to the fields. You'd carry your infant with you, strapped to your back, working while the baby slept or cried. When feeding time came, you'd stop briefly, nurse, then continue working. And then there was infanticide. We touched on this earlier in the context of famine, but it deserves more discussion because it was primarily women who faced this impossible decision and performed the act. Mabiki, thinning out, was the euphemistic term. When a family already had more children than they could feed, when another pregnancy occurred that threatened everyone's survival, the newborn might be suffocated shortly after birth. This was done by the mother, by the midwife, or by the grandmother, the older women handling the awful task to spare men from it. This practice was never officially sanctioned. It was never openly discussed. But it happened, particularly in northeastern Japan, where winters were harsher and famines more frequent. Buddhist priests railed against it. Authorities occasionally prosecuted it when cases became too public. But everyone understood why it happened. And informal social pressure to keep families small enough to survive often outweighed religious and legal prohibitions. The psychological toll of making such a decision, of performing such an act, is something we can barely comprehend. Imagine bearing a child after 9 months of pregnancy and difficult labor, only to end its life within hours of birth because you couldn't feed another mouth. Imagine living with that knowledge, that guilt, that grief for the rest of your life. And imagine doing it more than once. Women's legal status was firmly subordinate. The traditional formulation was that a woman should obey her father before marriage, her husband after marriage, and her son when widowed. You had no independent legal identity. You couldn't own property in your own name. You couldn't enter into contracts. You couldn't make legal complaints without male family members' support. You existed under the authority of men throughout your entire life. Sexual assault and domestic abuse received little legal attention. Rape wasn't considered a serious crime unless it involved women of the samurai class, and even then, the victim's family often bore the shame. Domestic violence was considered a private family matter. A husband could beat his wife with impunity. If she complained to village elders or family, she'd likely be told to be more obedient, less difficult, a better wife. Some peasant women did wield significant power within their households, particularly in agricultural households where their labor was essential and their judgment respected. A capable farm wife could effectively run the family's economic life, managing crops and finances, and making crucial decisions. But this power was informal, dependent on individual circumstances, and always subordinate to male authority in the public sphere. Women could not participate in village governance. The monthly gonengumi meetings were attended by male heads of households. The village headman was always male. When disputes needed to be resolved or decisions made, men spoke and women remained silent. Your opinions might be heard in private, might influence your husband's positions, but in public forums, you had no voice. The clothing regulations hit women particularly hard. You wore rough hemp, undyed or in plain colors. No silk, no elaborate patterns, nothing decorative. Long hours of labor left no time for personal grooming beyond basic cleanliness. Your hair, probably cut short to make work easier, was tied back simply. Your hands were rough and calloused. Your face was weathered from constant sun exposure. The romanticized image of Japanese femininity, the white painted faces, and elaborate kimonos and delicate movements, that was geisha. That was samurai women. That wasn't you. And yet, despite all this, peasant women survived. They endured. They found small moments of joy, small spaces of autonomy. They formed bonds with other women, sharing labor and childcare and knowledge. They taught their daughters to be strong, to persevere, to survive. They maintained festivals and traditions, passing down folk wisdom and songs and stories. They were not passive victims, but active participants in their communities, fighting within the constraints of their circumstances to make life bearable. The festivals provided rare opportunities for women to have public roles. Local religious celebrations often involved women performing specific rituals or dances. These moments of visibility, of being seen and acknowledged, must have felt precious. For a few hours, you weren't just another laborer bent over rice paddies. You were a ritual specialist, a performer, someone with knowledge and importance. Some women became midwives, traveling between villages to help with births. This gave them mobility unusual for peasants, a degree of independence, and respect in their communities. Other women might be herbalists, keepers of traditional medicine, or prayer specialists at local shrines. These roles were marginal, never threatening male authority, but they provided some measure of status and purpose beyond endless field labor. But let's not romanticize. The vast majority of peasant women's lives were consumed by labor and childbearing, by survival and endurance, by watching their children suffer and being unable to help. They were more than their oppression, yes, but their oppression was real, crushing, and escaped by almost no one. The system ground women down with special efficiency, using their bodies as tools for reproduction and labor until those bodies broke and were discarded. One of the cruelest aspects was that the system required women's complicity. Grandmothers taught granddaughters to be obedient, to accept their fate, to not question the order of things. Mothers raised sons to expect female subservience. Women enforced foot binding. No, wait, that was China. But women did enforce the social expectations on each other, policing behavior, criticizing those who stepped out of line, because the alternative was risking the whole family's position in the community. To resist was to endanger everyone you loved. So you didn't resist. You complied, you conformed, and you taught your daughters to do the same. This was the reality for women peasants in feudal Japan. Productive units whose labor was essential but unacknowledged, whose reproduction maintained the next generation of laborers, whose suffering was so normalized as to be invisible. They were, in the most literal sense, half citizens, half persons. Their humanity systematically diminished by a system that required their work but denied them personhood. Sparks in the darkness, resistance, culture, and the human spirit. But here's what the system couldn't crush entirely: the human spirit's insistence on meaning, on dignity, on resistance. Not grand, romantic resistance. Not heroic revolutionaries storming castles. But something more calculated, more sophisticated than most people realize. And occasionally, when the pressure grew too great, explosive uprisings that genuinely threatened domain stability. The Ikki, peasant uprisings, were a recurring feature of the Edo period, particularly in its later years. Some were small and local, a single village protesting a specific injustice. Others were massive, coordinated affairs involving thousands of peasants from multiple domains. But here's the surprising part that changes how we understand these events. These weren't mindless riots or desperate mobs. They were sophisticated political actions, carefully planned, strategically executed, with clear demands and calculated risks. Recent historical analysis of uprising documents reveals something remarkable. The typical iki began with peasant leaders, usually village headmen, wealthy peasants, or the educated sons of prominent families, organizing secret meetings. But they weren't just venting frustration. They were assessing grievances against documented precedents, judging whether the daimyo had truly overstepped acceptable bounds according to customary law, and deciding if action was justified. This is crucial to understand. Peasants weren't revolutionaries trying to overthrow the system. They were, in many cases, conservatives demanding that lords adhere to traditional obligations. If they decided to act, they'd circulate petitions signed in a distinctive way that shows remarkable political sophistication. Names written in a circle rather than a list, so no one could be identified as the ringleader by being first. This was called a karakasa renpanjo, an umbrella or circular covenant. The circular arrangement itself carried symbolic meaning. We stand together as equals, all equally responsible, all equally committed, refusing the hierarchy that usually defined every aspect of their lives. Then the peasants would mobilize. Sometimes thousands of them would gather at the castle town, camping outside the daimyo's residence, refusing to leave until their demands were heard. They'd present their grievances formally, respectfully, following proper protocols. They weren't attacking the system's legitimacy. They were calling on the daimyo to fulfill his obligations as a benevolent ruler. This was a risky strategy, walking a knife's edge between permissible petition and impermissible rebellion. If the daimyo responded favorably, granted concessions, lowered taxes, or dismissed corrupt officials, the iki could end peacefully. The leaders might still be punished, executed as examples, but their villages would benefit from the changes they'd won. Many uprisings ended this way, a grim calculus where leaders sacrificed themselves for their community's survival. But if the daimyo refused, if he responded with force, the iki could escalate. Peasants might attack the homes of hated officials or wealthy village headmen seen as exploitative. They might destroy records, burn rice warehouses, target the infrastructure of tax collection. This was dangerous, potentially suicidal, but it happened. When pushed far enough, when desperation outweighed fear, peasants fought back. The 1686 Jokyo Uprising in the Matsumoto domain is a famous example. When the domain government raised taxes to a 70% rate, villagers recognized this as unsustainable and unjust. Village headman Tada Kasuke led thousands of peasants in a peaceful appeal to the castle. Initially successful, they received written promises of tax relief, but a month later, the domain arrested Kasuke and other leaders. They were executed along with male members of their families, including children as young as 5 years old. The brutality of the response was meant to terrify, to ensure no one would dare resist again. Yet uprisings continued throughout the Edo period. Recent scholarship has documented over 1,200 major peasant uprisings during these 2.5 centuries, with countless smaller protests that didn't make it into official records. The 1853 Nanbu Uprising in northeastern Japan mobilized tens of thousands of peasants across multiple domains. The Shimabara Rebellion of 1637, though primarily motivated by religious persecution of Catholics, involved 40,000 peasant rebels who held out for months against overwhelming military force before being annihilated. But here's what might surprise you. These uprisings sometimes actually worked. This is the part that's often left out of the narrative. Statistical analysis of domain records by modern historians reveals a pattern. Domains that experienced large-scale iki often reduced tax rates in the years following the uprising. Not always, not dramatically, but measurably. The threat of rebellion, the actual cost of suppressing uprisings, the potential for daimyo to be punished by the shogunate for losing control, all of these created real incentives for compromise. One study found that domains experiencing major ikki saw tax rates drop an average of 3 to 4 percentage points in subsequent years. That might not sound like much, but when you're operating at subsistence level, the difference between a 50% tax rate and a 47% tax rate could mean the difference between your family eating or starving. Peasants had no formal political power, no representation, no voice in government. But through collective action and willingness to sacrifice, because the leaders were almost always executed even when uprisings succeeded, they could influence policy. It was democracy by riot, power claimed through desperation, but it was a form of power nonetheless. Beyond uprisings, there were subtler forms of resistance. Foot dragging on corvée labor projects, accidentally damaging tools or working slowly enough to miss deadlines, hiding part of the harvest from tax collectors, underreporting yields, finding ways to skim a little extra grain for your family. These were dangerous activities, potentially resulting in harsh punishment if caught, but they happened constantly. Then there was flight, chusan, abandoning your village entirely, fleeing to another domain or to cities where you might disappear into anonymity. This was illegal, of course, and the gonengumi system meant your fellow villagers would be punished for your escape. But some people chose this anyway, so desperate that they'd accept the guilt of endangering their neighbors rather than spend another day in their circumstances. Cities offered possibilities that villages didn't. Edo, by 1700, had a population of over 1 million, making it one of the largest cities in the world. Osaka, Kyoto, Nagasaki, all were growing urban centers with diverse economies and more fluid social structures. If you could make it to a city, if you could find work as a laborer or servant, or in one of the many small industries, you might achieve a degree of freedom impossible in your home village. You'd still be poor, still at the bottom of society, but you'd be free of the specific web of surveillance and control that defined village life. And even within villages, even amid grinding poverty, there was culture. Festivals marked the agricultural calendar, providing rare opportunities for celebration, for communal bonding, for joy. The rice planting festivals in spring, harvest festivals in fall, New Year celebrations. These were times when work paused, when special foods might be prepared, when music and dance and ritual brought the community together. Storytelling was crucial. Professional storytellers traveled from village to village, sharing tales of historical heroes, ghost stories, moral fables, news from the wider world. Local folklore preserved collective memories, explained the landscape, provided moral instruction and entertainment. Women sang work songs in the fields, rhythms helping coordinate labor and passing time. These oral traditions were how culture perpetuated itself among an illiterate population. Some villages maintained shrines to local kami, indigenous spirits of the land. These shrines represented a connection to place, to ancestors, to something beyond the daily grind of survival. Religious festivals were some of the few legitimate occasions for communal gathering, for shared experience, for expressing emotions that had no other outlet. And there was art, though not the refined art of the wealthy. Peasants carved simple wooden figurines, decorated household items with rough paint, created beauty where and how they could. It was art as lived experience, integrated into daily life rather than set apart as special objects. The woven patterns in baskets, the carved designs on tool handles, the rhythms of work songs, all were expressions of aesthetic sense, of the human drive to make things beautiful even when you have almost nothing. Some domains permitted limited education for peasants. Village schools, Tarakoya, taught basic literacy and numeracy to children of wealthy peasants and sometimes to others. The curriculum was practical, reading contracts, calculating taxes, keeping accounts. But it also included moral instruction through Chinese classics and Buddhist texts. Literacy rates in Edo period Japan were higher than in most of contemporary Europe, though still concentrated among the upper classes and wealthy commoners. For typical peasants, reading and writing remained luxuries, but the possibility existed: a crack in the otherwise rigid social barriers. What I'm trying to convey is that peasants were not simply victims. They were complex human beings with internal lives, with relationships, with moments of happiness, even amid suffering. They found ways to assert their humanity within a system designed to crush it. They resisted when they could, endured when they had to, and created meaning and beauty in the small spaces the system couldn't fully control. This wasn't enough to make life good. It wasn't enough to change the fundamental injustice of the social order, but it was enough to survive, to maintain some measure of dignity, to pass something on to the next generation beyond just trauma and suffering. It was, in its own way, a victory, a small, stubborn, insufficient, but absolutely essential victory. The end of an era, conclusion and lasting impact. By the 1850s, the system was fraying. Peasant uprisings were becoming more frequent and more violent. Urban poor were rioting over rice prices. The rigid class structure was straining under economic pressures. Wealthy merchants, technically at the bottom of the social hierarchy, had accumulated enough financial power to lend money to impoverished samurai and daimyo. The entire edifice of Tokugawa society was becoming unsustainable. And then, Commodore Matthew Perry arrived with his black ships in 1853, demanding that Japan open to foreign trade. The shogunate's inability to resist Western military pressure exposed its weakness. Within 15 years, the entire system collapsed. The Meiji Restoration of 1868 overthrew the shogunate, restored formal power to the emperor, and began a rapid modernization program that would transform Japan into an industrial power. For peasants, the transition brought both liberation and new hardships. The rigid class system was officially abolished in 1871. You could change occupations, move to cities, even theoretically rise through ability rather than birth. But here's the twist that makes the story even darker. The land tax reform of 1873, while modernizing tax collection and making it more uniform, often actually increased the effective burden on many rural areas. Many peasants lost their land entirely and became tenant farmers. No better off than before, just with different oppressors. Others migrated to cities to work in factories, trading rice paddies for factory floors, exchanging one form of exploitation for another. The long-term psychological impact of the Edo period on Japanese society remains visible even today, and this is where our story takes its final, surprising turn. Historians and sociologists have long debated whether those centuries of rigid hierarchy and social control created cultural patterns that persist in modern Japan. The emphasis on group harmony, on not standing out, on conformity and obedience. These traits that outsiders often identify as distinctively Japanese. Do they trace back to the gonengumi and the constant surveillance of village life? It's a complex question scholars disagree on sharply. But consider this: Japan's transformation into a modern industrial power happened with remarkable speed and minimal resistance compared to similar transformations elsewhere. The same population that had been held in place for centuries suddenly mobilized for national projects with extraordinary discipline and coordination. The very mechanisms that had oppressed them, collective responsibility, group loyalty, hierarchical obedience, became tools of modernization. Here's the uncomfortable truth scholars grapple with. The Edo period created a population that was literate, organized, and habituated to following complex social rules. When those rules changed, when the energy that had been spent maintaining rigid hierarchy was redirected toward industrial production and military expansion, Japan shocked the world. By 1905, Japan had defeated Russia in war, the first Asian nation to defeat a European power in modern times. By 1940, Japan controlled much of East Asia. The same discipline that made peasants bow to samurai became discipline in factories and armies. The system that had crushed them for centuries had also, in a sense, trained them. That's the final, terrible irony. The surveillance, the discipline, the collective responsibility, the willingness to sacrifice individual needs for group survival. When Japan entered the modern world, these became tools of empire building, of industrial production, of economic competition. This doesn't excuse what happened to those peasants. It doesn't make their suffering meaningful or necessary. But it helps explain one of history's great paradoxes: how a feudal society that brutally oppressed 80% of its population transformed into a modern power with such extraordinary speed. For 2.5 centuries, 80% of Japan's population lived the lives we've described tonight. They woke before dawn and worked until exhausted. They went hungry while growing food. They watched their children die. They bent their bodies to the earth until those bodies broke. They did this not occasionally, but constantly, day after day, year after year, generation after generation, and they survived. That's the miracle, if you can call it that. Not just physically survived, though that alone is remarkable given the circumstances, but survived as human beings, with dignity and culture and resistance and hope, however fragile those might have been. Tonight, we've walked through a world that no longer exists. Thank whatever gods or fortune you believe in. The specific system of feudal Japanese peasantry ended over 1.5 centuries ago. But the questions it raises remain urgent. How do societies justify exploitation? How do systems of control maintain themselves across generations? What enables human beings to endure the unendurable? Where does resistance come from when resistance seems impossible? And perhaps most unsettling, how do the tools of oppression sometimes become the tools of survival and success? These aren't just historical questions. They're questions about the nature of human society, about power and oppression and adaptation. And perhaps by understanding this particular manifestation, this specific system that ground down so many human lives across so many years, we can better understand our own world, our own systems, our own challenges. The peasants of feudal Japan are long dead, but their story, their suffering, their resistance, their endurance, their complicated legacy remains. History speaks, if we're willing to listen. And tonight, for these hours together, we've listened to voices that have too often been overlooked, experiences that have too often been forgotten. So, as you drift toward sleep, think about them. Not with simple pity, though compassion is appropriate, but with recognition of their complexity, their humanity, their lives that were so much more than their oppression, even though their oppression was overwhelming. Think about what they endured. Think about what they achieved despite everything. Think about the fact that you, comfortable in your bed, able to eat when hungry, and seek medicine when sick and move freely through the world. You are living a life those peasants could scarcely have imagined. And maybe, just maybe, feel a little grateful. Not because their suffering makes your life meaningful. It doesn't work that way. But because understanding historical realities helps us appreciate present freedoms while remaining vigilant about present injustices, wherever they exist. You wouldn't have lasted a day as a peasant in feudal Japan. The title isn't hyperbole, it's simple truth. But they lasted decades, centuries. They broke under the weight of the system, but they never quite shattered completely. And somehow, impossibly, they maintained enough of their humanity to pass something vital on to their descendants. That's the story. Sleep well, knowing you've witnessed something important tonight. Not just the suffering of the past, but the stubborn resilience of the human spirit when confronted with systems designed to break it. Good night. If you found this journey into history meaningful, if you appreciated the depth of research and the respect shown to those who suffered, consider subscribing to Sleepable History. Hit that like button to tell the algorithm this kind of content matters. Let me know in the comments what other historical experiences you'd like to explore. What other forgotten voices deserve to be heard? And sleep well, knowing that for all its challenges, the modern world offers freedoms and comforts that most of human history couldn't even imagine. Until next time.